The funny thing about this business is that your opinion changes once you see how everything actually works. When I was a young wrestler, I thought greatness was about being champion, closing shows, getting the biggest reaction. Years later, after working with some of the biggest names this industry has ever produced, I realized that's only part of it. Some people become stars, some become attractions, and a very small number become the reason an entire generation watches wrestling in the first place. Those are the people that stay with you. Those are the people I think about when somebody asks me who the greatest wrestlers of all time really are. The first guy I want to talk about is The Undertaker. What's funny is that most people immediately talk about the streak, the entrances, the character, all the things fans could see. For me, that's only part of the story. The real value of Undertaker was what happened behind the scenes. I've been around this business long enough to see generations of talent come and go. Some guys get hot for a few years, some become major stars. But very few earn the level of respect that he did. It didn't matter if you were a rookie walking in the locker room for the first time or a veteran with multiple championships, everybody paid attention when Undertaker spoke. That kind of influence can't be scripted and it can't be manufactured. You earn it over decades. What always impressed me was how he adapted. The wrestling business changed over and over again during his career. Different audiences, different styles, different eras, different expectations. Somehow he survived all of them while staying relevant. That's incredibly difficult. Most characters eventually run out of steam, fans move on, trends change. Undertaker found ways to evolve without losing what made him special in the first place. That's one of the hardest things any performer can do. I also know firsthand what it was like to be in the ring with him on the biggest stage possible. When we worked together at WrestleMania, there was always pressure because expectations were enormous. Everybody expected something memorable every single time. The thing about Undertaker was that he understood those moments better than almost anyone I've ever worked with. He knew how to make people care. He knew how to make a match feel important before the bell even rang. When I think about greatness, I don't just think about talent. I think about consistency. I think about leadership. I think about trust. For more than 30 years, WWE could put Undertaker in almost any position and know he would deliver. That's rare. That's why when I talk about the greatest wrestlers I've ever seen, his name is always part of the conversation. The next guy I need to talk about is Ric Flair. Before I ever became close with Rick, before Evolution, before all the years we spent working together, I already understood what he meant to this business. You can't spend any serious amount of time in professional wrestling without running into his influence. It was everywhere. The promos, the confidence, the way a world champion carried himself, the way a main event was structured. A lot of things people take for granted today trace back to Ric Flair. What made Rick different wasn't just that he was successful. Wrestling has had a lot of successful people. What made Rick special was that he stayed at the top while helping everyone around him become bigger stars. That's a skill that doesn't get talked about enough. Some performers can get themselves over. Rick had the ability to elevate entire cards. He could walk into a territory, work with the local hero, make that audience believe they were watching the biggest match in the world, and then do it again somewhere else a few days later. Not many people in history could do that. Then I got to know him personally, and honestly, that only increased my respect for him. During Evolution, I had a front row seat to how his mind worked. He saw details that most people missed. He understood crowd reactions, he understood pacing, he understood when to slow things down and when to push harder. There are lessons I learned from Rick that I still carry with me today. Not because he sat me down and gave speeches, but because I watched how he operated every day. One thing people forget is how long Rick stayed relevant. Different decades, different promotions, different generations of fans. Somehow he always found a way to matter. That's not luck. That's understanding the business at a level very few people ever reach. Whether he was wrestling, talking, managing, or simply appearing on television, people paid attention. If you're asking me what a world champion's supposed to look like, Ric Flair is one of the first examples that comes to mind. Not because of the championships themselves, even though there were plenty of those. It's because he made being champion feel important. He made it feel larger than life. That's a huge part of why his legacy has lasted this long. Decades later, people are still chasing a standard that Ric Flair helped create. Another name that belongs on this list is Stone Cold Steve Austin. What's interesting about Steve is that when people talk about him today, they usually start with the catchphrases, the beer trucks, the glass breaking, all the moments that became part of pop culture. I get it, because those moments were huge. But if you were actually in the business during that period, you understood something even bigger was happening. Steve wasn't just popular. He was changing the entire direction of the company in real time. I've seen a lot of stars in wrestling. I've seen guys get incredibly hot with audiences. What happened with Steve was different. Every week there was a feeling that anything could happen once he appeared. The audience wasn't simply reacting to a character. They believed in him. They connected with him in a way that's incredibly difficult to create. That's why the Attitude Era exploded the way it did. Steve became the center of it. I worked with him during some of the biggest years WWE ever had, so I got to experience it firsthand. You could feel the energy before the show even started. Fans wanted to see what Austin would do next. They wanted to see who he would confront. They wanted to hear what he would say. That's a level of anticipation very few performers have ever generated. It wasn't manufactured, it was real. What I respected most about Steve was how hard he fought for every opportunity he got. He wasn't supposed to become the face of the industry. There were plenty of people who looked more marketable on paper, plenty of people who seemed safer choices. Steve forced everyone to change their minds because the audience chose him. Once that happened, there was no stopping it. Even now, years later, his influence is still everywhere. Every wrestler who tries to connect with an audience on a genuine level owes something to Steve Austin, whether they realize it or not. That's why I don't look at him as just another top star from a successful era. I look at him as one of the rare performers who changed the business permanently. That's a different category entirely, and it's why his name belongs among the greatest wrestlers I've ever seen. The next person on my list is John Cena. I've known John from the very beginning of his WWE journey, and what always stands out to me isn't what happened when he became the face of the company. It's what happened before that. A lot of people only remember the main events, the championships, the sold-out arenas, but I remember watching someone who was constantly trying to figure out how to become better. That's not something every top star has. What made John's career unique was the amount of responsibility he carried for such a long time. It's easy to become popular. It's much harder to stay at the top year after year while being the person the entire company depends on. That's a different kind of pressure. Every media appearance, every major event, every important storyline eventually came back to John. Whether fans loved him or hated him, they reacted. And in this business, that's one of the most valuable things you can have. I've always believed that one of the hardest jobs in wrestling is being the guy who has to carry the company through an entire era. People love to compare generations, but they often forget how difficult that role actually is. You're expected to perform every night. You're expected to represent the company publicly. You're expected to stay consistent no matter what happens around you. John handled that responsibility longer than most people realize. The thing that impressed me most was his work ethic. There were no shortcuts. There was no moment where he decided he had done enough. Whether it was television, live events, charity work, media appearances, or major matches, he approached everything with the same level of commitment. That's one of the reasons younger talent respected him so much. They saw somebody who never expected special treatment despite being the biggest star in the company. When I think about the greatest wrestlers of all time, I don't just think about moments. I think about eras. I think about who defined those eras. For more than a decade, WWE and John Cena were connected in a way that's very difficult to separate. Very few performers have ever been trusted with that level of responsibility. Even fewer have succeeded at it. That's why, for me, John Cena absolutely belongs in this conversation. And the last name I want to talk about is Hulk Hogan. This is where these conversations usually get interesting because everybody has an opinion on Hogan. Some people focus on one era, some focus on another. Some look at the headlines, some look at the controversies. But when we're talking about the greatest wrestlers of all time, I think you have to start with one simple question. What did this person do for the business? And when you look at Hogan through that lens, the impact is impossible to ignore. A lot of fans today grew up in a completely different wrestling world. They see giant stadium shows, global television deals, premium live events, streaming platforms, and they assume wrestling was always that big. It wasn't. There was a time when this industry looked very different. Hogan arrived at the exact moment the business was expanding beyond what it had ever been before, and he became the face of that expansion. Millions of people who had never watched wrestling suddenly knew who Hulk Hogan was. That's a level of mainstream recognition very few performers in history have reached. What always impresses me about Hogan's career is that most people only talk about one version of it. They talk about Hulkamania. They talk about the red and yellow gear. They talk about the packed arenas and the incredible popularity. That's obviously a huge part of the story. But what separates Hogan from many other stars is that he reinvented himself when most people thought his time at the top was over. The move to the NWO changed wrestling again. Suddenly, an entirely new generation was paying attention. Very few performers have been the central figure in one wrestling boom. Hogan was at the center of two. That's one of the reasons I always look at him differently than many people do. I'm not just looking at individual matches. I'm looking at influence. I'm looking at business. I'm looking at growth. I'm looking at how many people entered this industry because they watched Hulk Hogan as kids. I'm looking at how many future stars were inspired by him. Those things matter. They matter a lot. At the end of the day, greatness isn't about being perfect. No legendary career is. Greatness is about impact. It's about leaving the business in a different place than you found it. When I think about who shaped professional wrestling into what it became, Hulk Hogan's name has to be part of that conversation. Whether people agree with him, disagree with him, love him, or criticize him, they're still talking about him decades later. That tells you everything you need to know about the size of his legacy. When I look back at this list, what stands out to me is that none of these guys became great for the same reason. That's something people often miss when they have these debates. There isn't one formula for greatness in professional wrestling. The Undertaker built a legacy through consistency, respect, and longevity. Ric Flair became the standard that generations of champions tried to follow. Steve Austin changed the direction of the entire industry. John Cena carried WWE through an era where the spotlight was on him every single day. Hulk Hogan helped take wrestling from a regional business to a global phenomenon. What connects all five of them is influence. Every wrestler who came after them was affected by something they did. Maybe it was a character, maybe it was a promo, maybe it was a match, maybe it was the way they handled pressure at the highest level. Their fingerprints are still all over this business today. I've been lucky enough to work with some of these guys, learn from some of them, and compete against some of them. That gives me a perspective most people don't have. I've seen what happened when the cameras were rolling, and I've seen what happened when they weren't. That's why my opinion isn't based on statistics or championship counts. It's based on the impact they had on the business and the people around them. Will everybody agree with my list? Probably not. That's the fun part of wrestling. Every fan has their own answer. But when I think about the people who helped define professional wrestling at the highest level, these are the five names that immediately come to mind. And honestly, I don't think the history of this business can be told without every one of them.